Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Tae Hyun, a senior researcher at the East European and Balkan Institute, which is the host of today's conference. I warmly welcome you and thank you each and every participant of this conference. Now I formally announce the opening of the 2021 EEBI International Conference. The theme of this year's conference is Transitions and Social Movements in Eastern Europe since the end of the 20th century, Memories and Accountability. First, we will hear an opening address by Kim Seong Hwan, Director of East European and Balkan Institute, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Please give a warm welcome to Director Kim Seong Hwan.
Dear professors, colleagues and researchers, my name is Seong Hwan Kim. As director of the institute, I am very honored to make the opening speech of today's conference. This conference is a great opportunity for scholars to show their endless interest and academic enthusiasm for the transition of the Eastern Europe. More than 30 years have passed since the beginning of the transition of Eastern Europe from communism to democracy, and 15 years since the beginning of integration of Eastern European countries to the European Union. In 1989, the communist system collapsed and the transition to a new system began. Around 2004, several Eastern European countries began to join the EU. In order to comprehensively analyze and evaluate these two major transformations that occurred in Eastern Europe, our institute has been working on a long-term project with the support of the National Research Foundation of Korea since 2019. The great transition of Eastern Europe symbolized the transformation from communism and socialism to democracy and the market economy over the course of years. For the understanding of these changes, it's necessary to break away from the perspective of individual academic fields and analyze the situation from a comprehensive and macroscopic perspective. Before ending my speech, I'd like to thank Professor Dennis Hart for serving once again as the chairman of the discussion. Through today's conference, I believe that Professor Vladimir Tismăneanu's keynote speech and all of the presentation will provide a large contribution for scholars studying Eastern Europe and enrich our knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening address, Director Kim Seong Hwan. Next are congratulatory remarks by Kim Seong Hwan, President of Asian Association of Central and Eastern European Studies. Please welcome President Kim Seong Hwan.
Dear distinguished professors and colleagues, the so-called dismantling of the East European bloc, symbolized by the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, and the following transformation of the Central and East European countries, CEC, is one of the most influential events that changed the political landscape of modern European history. And consequently, many related studies have been conducted. The transformation and transition of the CEC is also a priori reference to the homework that the unified Korea in the future must carry out successfully. The Asian Association of Central and East European Studies, AACES, and the East European and Balkan Institute, EEBI, at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies have been conducting various humanities studies on the CEC for the past 30 years. These two academic and research institutions are unique of their kind in Korea, and in this regard, it is more than understandable for them to pay a special attention to the process of the transformation and its result in the CEC. AACES and EEBI held an international conference on the subject of reinterpretation of the transformation and transition of East Europe last year, and this year of 2021, they are consecutively organizing a conference on the subject of transitions and social movements in East Europe since the end of the 20th century, memories and accountability. This conference is special to us in that the prominent scholars from the very Central and East European countries will share their views and perspectives with us. It is a great honor and pleasure for me as president of AACES to give a congratulatory speech at such a meaningful conference. I would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Seong Hwan Kim, the director of EEBI, and to all researchers and participants who I'm sure will make today's conference successful. Thank you.
Thank you for your congratulatory remarks, President Kim Seong-hwan. Next is our keynote speaker, a well-known and well-respected scholar, Professor Vladimir Tismăneanu. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce you to the conference participants and our global audience. We are thrilled to have Dr. Tismăneanu as a keynote speaker, particularly because of his world-renowned research in the relationships among nationalism, communism, and neo-Stalinism in Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc. Many people in the audience would know Dr. Tismăneanu for his work in historical accountability in Romania. In 2006, Dr. Tismăneanu was appointed by then Romanian President Traian Băsescu to the Presidential Commission for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship in Romania. The title of the keynote speech is Lenin's Ghost, Legacies of Historical Hubris. Let us warmly welcome Dr. Tismăneanu.
So let's start with my presentation. Greetings to everybody from Washington, D.C. Here it's precisely 11 a.m. and it's a sunny and hot day. And we are going to discuss sunny and non-sunny ideologies, hot and cold ideologies as we look. We are in May 2021 and we look forward to the events to come and how much we can anticipate, how much we can forecast, so to speak. I always say, and perhaps I should start with that revolutions, which is the topic I've studied for, although my students keep saying that I don't look my age, but I have a certain age. Okay, so I've been studying revolutions for at least 45 years. And one of the conclusions that I've reached regarding that is the fact that revolutionary meteorology is extremely whimsical. It is very hard to predict the way we predict thunderstorms in the evening. It is sometimes they happen, other times they don't. Revolutions are phenomena that occur to the surprise of everybody. My example, and it's linked to the presentation I put together for this event, is Lenin in Switzerland. Lenin is in Switzerland for the last 2 years, let's say, between 1915, 16, 17. He's in exile. He lives initially he lives in Geneva, then he moves to Zurich. He's in Zurich, he reads Hegel, and in early February 1917, Lenin has a meeting with a group of Swiss workers. I wish our friend in Pyongyang were to listen to our presentation, maybe he will. in order to know how, because I studied a lot the Romanian Revolution, I would say a few things about it, but assuming that I have the time, I'll do it. But, you know, whom I have in mind, the dictator there, okay, in South Korea. Okay, so, sorry, in North Korea. So Lenin speaks to these workers, and he says, my generation of revolutionary leaders was born, keep in mind, on April 22nd, 1870. So at that moment, Lenin is 47, okay? Actually 46, he has not turned 47 yet. And my generation of revolutionary leaders may not, and most likely will not be alive when the world revolution would break out, would start. When Tsarism would be overthrown and our ideas would come to power. Early February 1970. 2 weeks later, the February Revolution takes place in Russia. The Tsarist regime is overthrown. Like other parties, the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Parties of workers is legalized by the provisional government, and Lenin has to go or wants to go to Russia and forgets about his forecast that his generation of revolutionary leaders would not experience in their lifetime the revolution. Lenin takes the famous seal train, crosses, Germany, and via Sweden, he gets off at the Finland station in April 1970. The Bolshevik elite is there to wait for the genius to arrive. The eagle of the revolution, as they used to call him. He gets off the train, so they invite him for a dinner in the palace of former ballerina and the Tsar's mistress, or allegedly, reportedly, whatever, the Tsar's mistress. Okay, so they had prepared a nice dinner for Vladimir Ilyich. He said, no. I want to say a few things. And he delivers the April thesis, in which he presents the program of the transformation, what he calls, of the bourgeois liberal revolution into a proletarian revolution. All the Politburo members are convinced that he is nuts. Okay. So after the April thesis are delivered, and other things happen, Lenin goes into exile, into hiding, and is in Finland. Finland at that moment was a quasi-autonomous part of the Russian, it's not an empire anymore, of the Russian Republic. And what he does, I mean, Lenin, whenever he had some leisure time, he would either read or write or both. So he writes, and he writes a very important book, which is called State and Revolution. Okay, and then it goes back, and the rest is, as a former Slovene dissident says, is Revolution at the Gates. I have in mind Slavoj Žižek with his collection of Lenin's writings before February and October 1917. And this is the, let's call it, the Leninist breakthrough, the Leninist moment that nobody had anticipated. But I'm saying that trying to do my homework for this conference, I put together a few thoughts, looking back into other things that I've written, because Lenin has been a very important topic in my own on my own research agenda. And it's called Lenin's Ghost. And it's called, I have a text, I need to update a little bit the footnotes, and then Tae Hyun, I'll send it to you if you want to have it, the text. Okay, so I'll not stick to everything in the text because, it speaks for itself. And I have no problem, but it needs to be a little bit edited and so on. So, Lenin's Ghost, and the subtitle is Ideological Polarizations in the 21st Century. What do I mean? And I prepared a number of books that I want to show and to share with those who are going to watch this lecture. Okay, what do I have in mind? I have in mind a book that I consider one of the seminal books on a list of, let's say, 12 books that I consider fundamental for understanding the 20th century. And let me say it very clearly at this point, that we can talk about the short 20th century, as Eric Hobsbawm was saying, between 1914 and 1989. And, if I may, the long 20th century, which I try to discuss here, which starts indeed with 1914, with World War I, and continues up to the moment we are recording this lecture. So in other words, let's face it, conventional boundaries between centuries are not mandatory when we to be kept in mind when we discuss ideas. Ideas have a life of their own. They don't necessarily belong to the 19th century, 20th century. They migrate from century to century. They inform political practices from one century into another century. Trotsky, when he attacked Lenin, called Lenin in his very, that was in the first stage of their relationship. Later, of course, they became very close to each other, to the extent Lenin called Trotsky the most brilliant member of the Central Committee, that including himself, and that's quite a compliment from Lenin. Okay, Trotsky used to call him Maximilian Lenin. The hint was to, of course, the French Revolution and the Jacobin leader, Maximilien Robespierre. Okay, so Robespierre was a figure of the 18th century, right? 1789, died beheaded, guillotined, which was his favorite way of dealing with other people. So he got it himself. So Robespierre stands for absolute uncompromising intransigence. And Lenin represented absolute uncompromising intransigence. Uncompromising up to a certain point. He knew how to make compromises, but that should be a topic for another lecture. I sent the watcher, the people who watch this lecture, of course, to a very good book about rotten and non-rotten compromises by Israeli political philosopher Avishai Margalit, which was published by Princeton University Press a few years ago. Okay, so when I speak about ideological polarizations, as I said, I have in mind this book by an Israeli political philosopher, the late Jacob L. Talmon, T-A-L-M-O-N. Jacob Talmon was a political philosopher, political historian, who taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he was a disciple and friend of Sir Isaiah Berlin. Before Sir Isaiah Berlin became Sir, he was just Isaiah Berlin. This is another book. So Talmon's book is called The Myth of the Nation and the Vision of Revolution, Ideological Polarizations in the 20th Century. My title is Ideological Polarizations in the 21st Century. I could have put the complete title of Talmon and change just the number, the 0 to 1, there in the number of centuries. Okay? Because I think, and my plea in this presentation is to consider these two items, these two concepts, nation and revolution, as telltale, as good predictors, if you want, or indicators. We are political scientists, so we operate with indicators and so on, or independent variables, okay? They are independent variables. Okay, so they would be clearly in a political science approach. You see, I left my notes aside and I'm elaborating freely at this point. Okay, so we look into the nation and the revolutions as being, to use the poli-sci jargon, the structures of opportunity. They don't act historically without the intervention of what Lenin would have called the subjective factor. In other words, what in political science we call agency. Okay, you need agency. For Lenin, agency was the party. Do we have at this moment this type of political parties that operate along the logic of the Leninist, ultra-centralized, sectarian very disciplined, almost military type of political party, what Lenin called the vanguard party. The party that does not march behind the masses. This is, of course, I don't know if any of you speak Russian, but in the Bolshevik jargon, it was a disease, and they called it deviation, like as bad as factionalism, and it was called khvostism, and comes from the word khvost, which is tail, tailism. Okay, tailism means when the party, instead of being ahead of the masses and moving the masses, making the masses see the future and move in that direction. Khvostism is you stay behind. Trade unionism, basically. And for Lenin, this was a political sin. Therefore, and I don't know, political sin, but clearly it was a political dead end if the revolution was the goal. So it won't lead to the revolution. And for Lenin, the most important thing was the revolution. He lived for the revolution, he lived off the revolution. I always say when I lecture on Lenin and Leninism, for me, by the way, the term Leninism and Bolshevism are the two terms are interchangeable. Semantically, they are the same thing. You say Bolshevism, you mean Lenin and Leninism. Okay, very simple. Okay, so, and I could deliver a whole lecture on that, but I think I don't need to convince anybody. This is, already accepted wisdom. Okay, so for Lenin, the party is sacrosanct. The party has a very important element there, which is the knowledge. And in a book, another book that I wanted to share with you, my friends, is this book by Martin Malia, which is called The Soviet Tragedy. I've been using for 30 years in my classes on politics, ideology, revolutions. It's still, although Professor Malia passed away 15 years ago or so, it's still as Times Literary, no, let's call David Remnick, the current editor of The New Yorker, former Washington Post bureau chief in Moscow, and author of Lenin's Tomb, a very important book. I don't have it, I should have shown it. It's in the other office here. So I'm taping this from my home office, okay, like so many of us. Writes David Remnick here. So The Soviet Tragedy by Martin Malia, published by Free Press, probably in 91 or 92. So The Soviet Tragedy is an essential coda to the literature of Soviet studies, insofar as he returns to the power of ideology, emphasis on this. Okay, as returns the power of ideology to its central place in Soviet history, emphasize ideology and the central place ideology has in the Soviet reality history. Malia has made an enormous contribution. He has written the history of a utopian illusion and the tragic consequences it had for the people of the Soviet Union and the world. We still live. As I'm not going to show my book, that book, I'll show other books. Okay, The Devil in History. By the way, I know that at a certain moment I received, I have no problem if it is going to stay in my lecture. I received royalties for a Korean translation from the University of California edition of The Devil in History. It was very pleasant to receive the check, but I've never heard whether that Korean translation did come out and it exists. Okay, so please check with me. So it's called The Devil in History, and it's the subtitle is whatever, Communist Fascism and a Few Lessons of the 20th Century. Okay, so the devil in history has not disappeared. As you know, the devil, like God, is immortal. So, okay, so the devil in history is with us in the 21st century, by which I mean that huge ideologically driven follies, illusions, let's use another term, fallacies, will be with us. And we see them coming back. So I presented these two books. Okay, so in the early 1990s, the illusion was, more than illusion, it was the expectation that the demise of the Soviet bloc in 1989, the revolutions of 1989, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, sealed by the document adopted in December 1991, would create not a democratic paradise, but would create a world more propitious, more favorable, more hospitable for liberal values. The epitome of this approach, of course, was The End of History by my friend Frank Fukuyama, and the celebration of democracy, liberal democracy, as the terminus ad quem, as we go, of history. In this Hegelian Marxist or Marxo-Hegelian historiosophy, there was a sense, let's call it, of teleological optimism, that we are moving from that to that, and that was horrible, the realm of the devil, and we are moving the evil empire, to use the Reagan formulation, and we are moving towards the radiant liberal future. Having been exposed from a very early age in my life to this type of Hegelian perspectives and Marxian perspectives and so on, I'm extremely skeptical of historical determinism. As I mentioned before, if Lenin, who knew something about revolutions and who knew something about Marx, and who during his Swiss exile did something that was missing in his Bildung, in his intellectual formation, that means he read Hegel. Lenin did not read Hegel, had not read Hegel before 1915. But between 1915 and 1917, the only thing he read was Hegel in German. And you can see his notes and so on, his philosophical notebooks, okay, which show that he understood a lot. So we have to read pre-Hegelian Lenin with a sense of caution, to the extent, because Lenin himself said that those who do not read and understand Hegel have no idea what Marxism is about. Now, he had written a lot before 1915. What do we do with all the Lenin writings before he read Hegel? Oh, but this being said, I don't buy into this, what Isaiah Berlin called the teleological libretto, like in an opera. You know, you go to the opera, you go and see the magic flute or whatever else. Okay. By the way, Lenin was a great, great admirer, surprisingly so, of Richard Wagner. We all knew that Hitler was into the Wagner cult, but Lenin himself was a great admirer. As a matter of fact, at Lenin's funerals, based on the request of his family, the music was Richard Wagner's funeral march. Very interesting. We are in 1924, and Nazis come to power less than 10 years later. So speaking of the ideological polarization, so here we are. And what followed after that was a lot of frustrations, a lot of what I call malaise, a lot of confusion. In other words, instead of the New World Order that people were acclaiming, proclaiming, announcing, heralding, etc., we got something else. And very few people anticipated this coming world anarchy. One of them was Berkeley political scientist Ken Jowett. Ken Jowett published in, I'll tell you exactly the year, because I think it's one of the most important books. This was published in 1992. Okay. The New World Disorder, can you see it? There? The New World Disorder, the Leninist extinction. His argument there, at this moment, Ken, I think he's retired. He's a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So the argument Jowett came with was relatively simple, that instead of the big revolutionary upheaval of the 20th century, the pattern of which was the Russian Revolution under Lenin, fomented and symbolized by Lenin's intervention in history, okay, we'll have lots of, he would call, we're using the term from a very important German political and cultural columnist, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, will have civil wars, but he will call them microscopic civil wars, or micro, not macro. And he gave examples, like, for instance, the riots in LA, about which Hans Magnus Enzensberger wrote in 1991, and so, or 90. Okay, so we'll have new forms of discontent, new forms of questioning what appears to be the status quo, the established order, new forms of, if you want, you know, in my previous existence, I was a Frankfurt School scholar, and I know a lot about critical theory. Okay, so new forms of historical transcendence, that would be the term. Okay, and this could be ethnic, this could be religious, this could be moral majority type, and so on. And these would be the revolutions of the 21st century. So we are not in a post-revolutionary age, we are in, or a post-ideological age. We are in a new type of revolutionary age, and a, how do the term, an updated, if you want, moment of ideological warfare. And this brings me, because it's already 25 minutes of my lecture, and I was promised and promising only 20 minutes, but I wrote for this particular lecture, so I don't have the text for you because I did not write, I presented freely. Okay, but I have the conclusion, which I wrote the other day. The resurrection, or as Zizek says, the reenactment of Leninism. For those who don't know, Slavoj Žižek is a well-known political theorist, political philosopher that tries to bring in his worldview the ideas of Jacques Lacan's psychoanalysis, Hegel's philosophy, Karl Marx, Lenin, and it's a kind of very baroque construct that brings to, or a bric-a-brac, whatever you want to call it, and quite frequently extremely provocative, and even more frequently quite annoying. Okay, but you know, the Žižek, who is a very good, has a very good expertise of Frankfurt School, knows clearly this famous dictum by Theodor Wiesenthal Adorno, who said, in psychoanalysis, only the exaggerations are true. Okay, if, you know, in the same way, Žižek knows that unless he exaggerates, like Fukuyama exaggerated in 90, when he announced the end of history, you know, if you don't say that we have to reenact Lenin, nobody would pay attention to what you write. If you say we need to reenact Lenin, you know, from Seoul to Barcelona, everybody is going to talk about your ideas and would say either that you're a fool or a genius or both. Here we are. So the resurrection, reenactment of Lenin is evoked and invoked by Slavoj Žižek, French philosopher Alain Badiou, etc., does not mean, for me, a return to the old, tired, exhausted, hackneyed dogmas, but rather to the underlying, latent, yet pulsating pulse, okay, subcurrents of the Bolshevik ethos. The binary vision of the political world that Lenin professed, which for him was reducible to the who-whom relationship, or as Carl Schmitt would put it, friend and foe. Okay, friend and foe. By the end of his life, Carl Schmitt had become an admirer of Lenin's political view. Carl Schmitt being, of course, coming from a very, very different direction. But after what I said about Wagner, I'm not so surprised. Okay, so the cult of the, okay, so this would be the binary one. Kto kogo? Who is going to get rid of whom? We see it. Who is going to expel whom in this world? Who is going to exclude whom in our world? Who is going to write the rules of exclusion and the rules of acceptance? Who is going to define what is exclusion and what is self-defense? Okay. And so on and so forth. This is with us. As you are recording and I'm speaking, I can give you, and I'm sure in your conference there will be plenty of discussions about that. The second is the cult of the allegedly providential leader. I don't need to tell you, but from Matteo Salvini to Donald Trump to you name the person, we have the leader who comes to rescue the nation. So I wrote a whole book which is called Fantasies of Salvation. Okay, this is the fantasy of what, again, the Frankfurt School, Erich Fromm called the magic savior. The magic savior is around the corner. Okay, we're waiting for it. Berlusconi at a certain moment was the magic savior. And Berlusconi didn't go to the end. The magic savior doesn't stop short of taking over power. Okay. Then I would mention that rejection of the traditional political spectrum and the cultivation of, and that's an important topic for the conference and for other discussion, of the anti-enlightenment tradition. Here, I strongly recommend this book, which is the best in the field, Isaiah Berlin, The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Essays or chapters in the history of ideas. I'm not going to say more, but this is the best analysis for me of what counter-enlightenment means. And in my view, we are at this moment in full counter-enlightenment offensive. And I can elaborate, but at this moment, let me stick to what I wrote here. Lenin is, okay, illiberal, we see illiberal populist forms of organized belonging. Leninism implied three main axioms regarding the party and the revolution. Simply, in 3 words. Infallibility. It cannot, the party is always right. That was the anthem of the East German Communist Party. Okay? Die Partei hat immer recht. That was the party. The party is always right. I don't know what the party anthem of the North Korean Workers' Party is, but I'm sure it's something very much linked to the idea of the infallibility. The papist, let's say, pretends. Okay, somebody called it the claim to epistemic infallibility. Malia, in the book I mentioned before, quotes French, and I'll go back to the second axiom. Malia quotes Alain Besançon, the French Sovietologist, who said the difference between communists and early Christians is that the early Christians, the Christians of Jesus and immediately post-Jesus times, knew that they believed. The early communists, I don't know about the Kim dynasty. Probably Kim Jong-un is as convinced as I am that the whole thing is finished. But he cannot afford to say it, okay, for reasons that we can discuss separately. Okay. Now I'll give you an example. When communism collapsed in Bulgaria, and Todor Zhivkov was the big leader there, was under house arrest, not for the crimes perpetrated, but corruption. He was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was asked, at the end of the regime, were you still believing in communist ideology? And Zhivkov responded, do you take me for an idiot? Probably Kim Jong-un could answer the same way. Do you take me for an imbecile? No, but He acts the way he acts because this is the ideological constraint. If they don't stick to the ideology, they will stick to the gallows. Okay. And that's something which is, they know what happened to Honecker, they know what happened to Ceausescu, they know what happened, you know. And that's the reason they stick to the Juche, do I pronounce correctly? Juche ideology. Okay, so the three main axioms: infallibility, the second is inevitability, and the consolation for the crooks, and if you prefer, I call them the ideological gangsters or the ideological thugs. Whatever one can think about Lukashenko these days, he's not ideologically driven. Putin is a different story, and he's not happy with certain things that Lukashenko does. Okay, so infallibility, inevitability, irreversibility. The new party movements that we have seen around, from the redefinition of the Front Populaire under Marine Le Pen in France, different movements in Italy, and so on. We've seen them everywhere, okay, popping up. These new party movements have been operating along the same lines, manufacturing collective fears and stirring collective anxieties. The other, and think about Trump's reference to the foreigners, especially Mexicans and so on, as animals. This is the dehumanization of the other. Okay, the Asian is not as human as we are. The Jews are not as human, let alone the African Americans and so on and so forth. Okay, so racism is part of the world we live in. So the internet, and this is my last sentence, the internet, and here I am to say thank you, internet, because without the Zoom, this longer than expected lecture would not have been possible. Although I would have loved to visit Seoul, but that's not possible. Maybe sometime in the future if things calm down. And I'm sure the things calm down. Okay, so to explain why I'm so sure. My mom, who fought in the International Brigade, she was a nurse. Then she got her medical degree in the Spanish Civil War, got her degree in Moscow during the war, World War II. And her degree was in children's diseases, specialized in epidemiology. I grew up in a house. My mom was an epidemiologist. She knew a lot about viruses and all the rest. And I remember the last thing I told my students before the spring break in 2020. We didn't know that we'll see each other after that on Zoom. Still, the university was open at College Park, nice campus. Okay, and I said, guys, I don't know what's going to happen. But from my late mom, I know one thing: wash your hands as many times as possible. I knew it since I was 5 or 6 or 7. And whenever I was kept by her home, because I got the flu, I was so happy that I would stay home because I would be able to go out and play basketball, handball, football, you name it, soccer. Okay. Then she'd say, no, you don't stay home in order to go outside and play with your buddies. You stay home and you do not see your buddies. You stay home. It's before the mask. I did not wear the mask. But otherwise, all the measures that have been proposed until the vaccine arrived were the things I learned from my mom, who knew a lot of about the 20th century. So, do I sound pessimistic in this age of internet conspiracy theories, epidemics, as dangerous, if you want, politically speaking, as the big pandemic? Okay, do I sound pessimistic? Perhaps. But a pessimist, to quote one of my favorite Central European jokes, is nothing but a well-informed optimist. So this is my conclusion. I'm not a pessimist, but rather a well-informed optimist. And thank you, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much for your keynote speech. We will have 6 presenters, including myself, in today's conference. First, Professor Kaspars Kļaviņš gives his presentation. Professor Kaspars Kļaviņš is currently a professor at the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Latvia. Today's topic is Latvia's transition from communism to capitalism, 1986 to 2002. Please welcome Professor Kaspars Kļaviņš.
안녕하세요. Kaspars Kļaviņš입니다. Latvia 학교 교수님입니다. My presentation will be the transition of Latvia from communism to capitalism, 1987-2002. Any nation has its cursed times when eyewitness to the recent past are still quite alive and well and remember events from that period. For example, the collective memory of the Latvian people remembers the apocalyptic, I would say, even apocalyptic decade and a half that became like an abyss between the guaranteed but already decadent and dysfunctional status and income of the Soviet era, and the shocking unpredictability of non-limited capitalism. Unfortunately, however, the oral history of non-political and everyday life has not yet been academically analyzed, and there is a growing possibility that the time remaining for such interviews will be squandered. Any student of the history of the Soviet Union and the breakdown of this mighty empire must keep in mind 3 things. First, difference between the market and the real income. Second, the concept of nomenclature or nomenclatura, which refer to the several parts or several strata of central, regional, and local communist elites, Komsomol secretaries, trade union bosses, and secret KGB informers. Nomenclature's benefits included special bathhouses, special stores, special taxi vouchers, special vouchers for buying deficit goods, special grants, and special holiday permits. Third, the size and regional differences of the Soviet Empire, which lead to the inevitable local interpretations of leftist ideas, tribalism, and ethnic separatism. Unfortunately, there is no general study on this topic, with the best of the existing works still tending to view the different Soviet provinces as uniform bodies, which was not the case. For example, you can read in a book, Smith, The New Russians, 1989, as I would say for a general reading. But even this author thinks that Soviet Union was everywhere more or less the same, which was not the case. One should be forewarned that the general experience after 1987 beyond the Soviet Union's borders was in all aspects quite different from the Soviet experience. In 1985, when signs of the coming collapse of the Soviet Union became obvious, but were not yet acknowledged, Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic was one of the most developed regions of the Soviet Union, with income and living standards above those of Portugal or southern Italy, and in reality even higher due to the free health insurance, free education, right to work guaranteed to the Soviet citizens, and so on and so on. The general discontent towards the Soviet regime at that time was initially caused by the first signs of the breakdown of rationing and the idiotic tightening of mass culture censorship. The Latvian population, which had to come to accept its living standard of the 1970s as given was now dissatisfied by its inability to purchase any sophisticated products, appliances, and electronics, and the almost total lack of quality entertainment in the form of movies or books. You can read in a history of Latvia, the 20th century, 2006, that book would be sufficient on a basic level. But by the 1970s, Latvians were almost a minority in their own country, making up just about 52% of the population. The arrogance of the civilian and military bureaucracy, which was barely bearable, in the best of times became a painful obstacle as the distribution system for the most basic goods began to collapse, which started in 1987. There were enormous problems with food supplies in rural villages. To solve this problem, the local party bosses unofficially provided additional transportation or additional transport connections to the bigger cities, especially Riga, which is capital of Latvia, where goods were more available. Many Communist Party members in Moscow themselves wanted to improve their own material situation by following the cult of material benefits propagated in the West during the Cold War. And the Latvian Communist Party elite was no exception. So they were not real Marxists in a sense, and they were not real communists. The old system began to interfere with their ambitions and needed to be reformed. With the perestroika of Mikhail Gorbachev, a space for protests was opened, and protests began indeed. Although largely under the control of the KGB and also partly coordinated with the security forces of the Soviet Union. However, with the involvement of more radical and charismatic individuals, some of whom had previously been repressed for so-called anti-governmental activity, the protests became increasingly unpredictable, and there was a view and opinion that they may be out of control. Under different circumstances, the protests would have been suppressed by force. But the introduction of perestroika no longer permitted such a course of action. To keep political activity within limits, the communist-controlled Latvian Popular Front was created in late 1988. But it soon became an influential force of its own. After the first semi-democratic, I would say, elections on March 18, 1990, the Popular Front became de facto governing party of Soviet Latvia. The subsequent course of events was based on unresolvable conflict between three Soviet Latvian elites. First, the Latvian quasi-nationalists, or so-called nationalists, who had survived thanks to cultural autonomy and their own business skills. Second, the imported Russian bureaucracy and the Soviet military forces stationed in Latvia as a first-wave force at the end of the Second World War already. When following the disastrous coup d'etat in Moscow, Latvia became an independent state on August 23rd, 1991. No part of society, the economy, or the state was prepared for the freedom. Nobody. The leader of the Popular Front, the original revolutionaries, had already been replaced by Soviet-style technocrats. They know only one political recipe for an independent Latvia: anti-Marxist reforms with goals exactly opposite to communist goals. So they were anti-socialist in a narrow I would say, even a stupid sense. The new Latvian political elite of the early 1990s was a curious mixture of second-rate ethnic Latvian bureaucrats from the capital city of Riga and the newly arrived Latvian emigres who came in part with instructions from the security services of their previous residence countries or economic, financial, and technology corporations interested in the eastern direction. As politicians, they were all absolutely non-prepared to fight for a position or power. It was their luck to have very little competition at that time. With the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the chaos caused in Russia by the tyrannical or somehow absolutely non-prepared politician Boris Yeltsin, the former Russian-speaking elite in Latvia had no strength to retain any political power and retreated into the background of shadowy economic manipulations. They were gradually joined by thousands of former Soviet army officers who had been permitted to stay in Latvia after the general evacuation of Soviet forces in 1994. In 1992, just a few months after the declaration of the redeclaration of Latvian independence, society and civilization itself broke down in the country. And for the next decade, the Republic of Latvia was a quasi-failed state. Guaranteed income, housing, medical service, public transportation, and police protection finished to exist or became a caricature of their former selves. The monthly income in 1992-1993 did not exceed 20 or 30 United States dollars, and that is an optimistic assumption. Dangerous gangs took control of the streets, and in one incident, for example, a gang of criminals no larger than 50 persons attempted to take the parliament by force. For approximately 12 years, Latvia remained a country with a most unbelievable corruption. Only 10% of the Latvian population profited from this horror story, either by reckless theft or illegal business activities. Naturally, after the collapse of communist system, the first among the newly rich, Novorish, were people who in the old system had been directors of restaurants or larger stores, or former party elite bosses, and so on. The rest of the world, the recent history of Latvia serves as an example of what happens if one introduces a so-called free economy in a society without any business ethics or other stabilizing factors. For Latvia, it took just 5 years to fall from the level of Portugal to that of Haiti or Tanzania. Some aspects of the country's former quality of life were lost forever. The living standards of 1985 were partly regained only around 2004. And it took forced measures introduced by European Union after 1998 to make law, order, and ethics return to the country. Latvia's critically important geographical position as a crossroad between East and West, as it was called, was probably the only reason why the West showed such a mercy and restored some, let us say, order and some protection for the population. The people who took control of the former Soviet Latvia in September 1991 were, for lack of a better expression, a bunch of arrogant and ignorant bottom pushers without any real experience of statesmanship, unfortunately. A local Pandora box was opened, releasing all the ills of the Latvian mentality. People of different politics and faiths members of the early Latvian establishment all believed in doing nothing, trusting in Adam Smith's invisible hand or so-called free market, as a dull peasant trusts the wisdom of his master. 3 waves of privatization swept over Latvia: 1992, 1994, and 1997. The first privatization wave was the worst one, resulting in mass looting and resulting in a mass looting of sophisticated factories, workshops, and labs that could still produce market value goods. In just 2 years, agriculture in the form of industrial collective farms was destroyed without any hope of a system to replace it. Latvian industrial production collapsed for a decade and was eventually restored by foreign investment with very little participation on the part of local business. The new developments of independent Latvian industry and technology was partly based on elaborations of previous Soviet-era industries. Some industries remained or were developed already before the Second World War, but they were no more proper for contemporary conditions. But during the Soviet times, the science that were developed included medicine, chemistry, and also philology. So Latvian humanities, and yeah, I would say philology was also developed, but especially chemistry had been developed in Soviet Latvia since approximately 1965. Actually, Soviet Latvia was one of the centers of chemistry in the whole Soviet Union. A chemistry center had been developed in Uolaine, and that's a little city in Latvia, but a very important center for chemistry and pharmacy even today. And additional positions for students of chemistry had been created because according to the communist dream, chemistry can change everything. Since regaining independence, many major European Union supported projects were launched in Latvia on the basis of this same assumption. Latvia's first Western type elections in 1993 were won by a party made up of the remodeled remains of the Popular Front. This event is an important example of the sexual factor in politics. All the Latvian ladies voted for a certain politician who was considered a handsome stud in a popular opinion. The winning party, the Latvian Way, so-called Latvian Way, became dominant political force for the next 5 years and kept its influence for the 5 more years. Next elections in 1995 came as a national shock due to the number of elected populists. The parliament of 1995 was incapable of normal political activity, and the first technocrat cabinet was formed. The leader of these technocrats, as the people were soon to find out, used his newly acquired power to privatize for the benefits of themselves. Most of the large companies still in state control. As a lesser evil, the West allowed the so-called Popular Party rule until 2008. The moment when Latvia began its escape from the horrors of a failed state and set about returning to normality was on the day of parliamentary elections in 1998, in which the provisional technocrat cabinet at least became the largest political power as the Popular Party. For the next 4 years, Latvia prepared to give up its easily gained so-called full independence. 2002 saw the conclusion of talks between Latvia, NATO, and European Union. And the small Baltic country Latvia was accepted as a member of these mighty Western organizations. The first requirement of membership was at least the appearance of law and order, and the most shocking examples of criminality and corruption quietly disappeared. Thousands of Latvians were waiting for the European borders to open, dreaming of and focused on one of two cherished goals: to run away and settle anywhere outside of their native country, or to start a business at home in Latvia in cooperation with Western partners, or with partners in Asia. And already in that time, also the Asian partnership slowly started, which is very important for us today. What happened next is another story and no longer fits with the topic of this report. Thank you so much for your attention. 감사합니다. 진정하세요.
I enjoyed the presentation very much. Thank you, Professor Kaspars Kļaviņš, for your good work. Next speaker will be Professor Ignác Romsics. Professor Ignác Romsics is currently professor at the Eszterházy-Károly University, where he served as professor of modern Hungarian history and head of doctoral school till 2021. The topic to be presented is political and economic transformation in Hungary since the change of regime. Please welcome Professor Ignác Romsics.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, since the collapse of communism in 1989-1990, more than 30 years have passed. During this time period, Hungary, just like the other countries of the region, has experienced deep changes in all fields of the life. In my talk, I'm going to deal with three aspects of this transformation. They are as follows. First, the replacement of the one-party dictatorship by a multi-party democracy and following changes in political life. Second, the foreign political reorientation coupled with a new neighboring and minority approach. Third, the establishment of market economy based on private ownership of property instead of the Soviet-type land economy based on social and state ownership. Let's start with point one. The constitutional basis of the new democratic political system was coined in summer 1989 at the National Round Table, which was composed of the ruling Communist Party and the new oppositional parties. Its recommendations were presented as bills to the old National Assembly in September and October of the same year. Due to the favorable foreign political climate, the mostly communist MPs who were elected in 1985 accepted without any resistance all of the so-called fundamental laws. The most significant of them was Law 31, which modified the 1949 Communist Constitution. With this, Hungary reverted from the nominal status of a People's Republic, practically a form of state socialism, to that of a liberal, Western-type republic and a civic democracy. It provided comprehensive guarantees of human rights for citizens, prohibited all actions designed to secure an absolute hold on power, proclaimed a multi-party system, and stipulated that no party was to be allowed to have exclusive executive power. The new Hungarian Republic's supreme organ of state was the National Assembly. Besides its legislative functions, the National Assembly had sole authority to appoint holders of the most important state offices, such as members of the cabinet and other key bodies. It was also the only organ with the right to declare war and conclude peace treaties, proclaim a state of emergency, and authorize the use of armed force within the country or beyond the borders of the country. The institution of the Soviet-type presidium was abolished and replaced by the office of the President of the Republic, who, as the embodiment of national unity, was also Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and charged with safeguarding democratic operation of the state administration. The President could only dissolve the National Assembly under extraordinary circumstances, and then only if new elections were called. The Assembly's deliberations could also only be suspended for a maximum of 30 days. The head of state was elected for 5 years by the National Assembly. Another major fundamental law contained the arrangements for the Constitutional Court. This body, the members of which were to be appointed by the National Assembly for a term of 9 years, was given charge to undertake both preliminary and retrospective scrutiny of all legislation, to rule on all claims of infringement of constitutionally guaranteed rights, and to resolve any disputes that might arise over respective spheres of authority between the organs of central government and the self-governing local authorities. This made the Constitutional Court one of the most vital of all the state institutions, especially because it could check even an overwhelming parliamentary majority. A third important law set out the new franchise for the election of representatives to the legislative body, the National Assembly. It introduced a hybrid system combining elements of both majority voting and proportional representation. The first 3 elections were held in spring 1990. Since then, the Hungarian voters have gone 7 more times to the polling stations in order to re-elect the National Assembly. During the first 2 decades, big shifts in support occurred with each election. Between 1990 and 1994, Hungary had a right-wing national conservative. After that, a left-wing social liberal majority. This was once more followed by a right-wing conservative, then for 2 terms a left-wing social liberal government. In 2010, a right-wing conservative government was formed again. Since that time, this political force, led by Viktor Orbán, have held the power. The large fluctuations in the outcomes of the elections between 1990 and 2010 may be interpreted by the voters' unstable party preferences. This volatility, however, was an effect rather than a cause, whose source is to be sought in other factors. An important part of explanation is certainly the general lack of identification with individual parties. It is normal for electorates to use their votes to punish the party or parties in power when things are not going well, and to be tempted to reward opposition parties that promise better times ahead. An even more important factor may have been the sheer inconsistency of the position of the main parties, the shifts and modifications of platforms and ideology that they presented over the years. For all the big swings in voting patterns, 2 parties have nevertheless been able to build up more or less stable, more or less distinctive cores of support: the leftist Socialist Party, which governed in 3 cycles, and one of the new oppositional parties, the rightist Young Democrats, who have been in power since 2010. The main distinguishing feature of the voters' blocs is not so much occupational or class affiliation as subcultural factors such as religious views, attitude to the past, degree of social political integration before 1989, and place of residence with an urban-rural split. The regular voters for the socialist and leftist parties, for example, Democratic Coalition today, have been predominantly former party members and their dependents, while the Young Democrats have been supported by tradition-loving, nationalistically minded, and in part church-going professionals, further white-collar staff, and small entrepreneurs. Summing up the behavior of the Hungarian voters, we can conclude that 1/4 of the people are engaged leftist, 1/4 are engaged rightist, 1/4 have had no fixed political position, and 1/4 have not taken part in elections at all. As far as the foreign political reorientation is concerned, and by this I come to the second point, let me refer at first to the tidal shifts in international relations. In 1990 and 1991, the bipolar world order defined by the antagonism of the two superpowers collapsed. This process, started by the disintegration of the Soviet bloc in late 1989 and 1990, which was sanctioned by the formal dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon in 1991. Another landmark was the end of the Germany's divided existence on 3rd October 1990. Under the 1991 Maastricht Treaty, which took effect in January 1993, the 12th from 1995-15 and today 27 member states of the European Union bound themselves to ever greater economic, financial, social, and political integration. Another important change in the international context was the breakup of the Soviet Empire at the end of 1991. Although Russia has remained a major world power in terms of the sheer size of its population and territory, its national resources, and its nuclear arsenal, Europe's center of gravity has shifted even more decisively to the western half of the continent. During the latest years, the situation changed again. President Putin's Russia solidified itself as a regional great power. By these transformations of global political significance were unfolding, major regional upheavals were occurring just to the north and south of Hungary's frontiers. In 1993, Czechoslovakia split without a shot being fired into separate Czech and Slovak republics. Multi-ethnic Yugoslavia, by contrast, broke up in the course of a bitter and bloody series of wars between 1991 and 1995 into 6 county Kosovo region, even 7 independent states. The number of neighboring states of Hungary increased thereby from 5 to 7. These global and regional realignments changed fundamentally Hungary's position in European politics. The fall of the Iron Curtain has opened the way for rapprochement to Western Europe and integration into the network of Euro-Atlantic alliance. At the same time, new but historically conditioned tensions emerged between Hungary and its neighbors. These tensions have been, in the main, connected with the position of Hungarian minorities living mostly in Slovakia, in Ukraine, in Romania, and in Serbia. According to the censuses, their number has been about 2.5 million. Facing this new situation, the new Hungarian foreign political doctrine, elaborated in 1990-1991, had 3 main goals. First, withdrawal from the Soviet alliance system and accession to the Euro-Atlantic integrative organizations. Second, participation in regional economic and political organizations free from Soviet influence. And third, increased protection and support for the Hungarian minorities in the neighboring states. As for turning from east to west, the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary commenced in April 1989 and was completed in June 1991. By this time, the Warsaw Pact and Comecon had ceased to exist too. The removal of the Soviet military presence and these two acts restored full sovereignty to the Hungarian Republic. The successive Hungarian governments, on economic and security grounds allies, wanted to join the Western alliance systems as soon as possible. It soon became clear, however, that those Western political bodies were reckoning with a long, drawn-out process. Although the Council of Europe accepted Hungary's membership as early as November 1990, NATO and the European Community and later Union set various preconditions before they were willing to open negotiations on joining. So, the full NATO membership was achieved only in spring of 1999. Hungary was taken together with Poland and Czech Republic. Joining the organization was legitimized in 1997 by a referendum with a turnout of almost 50%. 85% of voters supported Hungary's request to join NATO. As for European Union, the negotiations lasted until the end of 2002. During this time, commercial relations between the EU and Hungary expanded rapidly. In 1989, the share of the 12th member organization in Hungarian exports was 25% and 29% in imports. By 2000, these percentages had increased to 76 and 71% respectively. The increase was caused primarily by the shift in Hungarian foreign trade from east to west. Our main partner became the unified Germany. Full membership of the European Union was achieved finally in 2004, together with Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic states. By these admissions, the number of the EU's members increased to 25. The government's request to join the EU was also legitimized by a referendum. 48% of voters turned out, and 86% of them supported accession. Turning to the second main foreign political goal, that is regional cooperation, there were two main initiatives. The so-called Pentagonale, which was known later as Central European Initiative, was aiming at cooperation of Italy, Austria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. It proved to be too large and lacking common interests, so it faded away quietly during the mid-1990s. The so-called Visegrad cooperation between Poland, Czechoslovakia, and later its two successor states, which was founded in 1991, seemed to be more promising. Although this organization is still alive, its original attraction weakened significantly. The reason for that is the lack of economic complementarity, linguistic, cultural differences, the characteristically pro-Western policy of Czech Republic, and lasting tensions between Slovakia and Hungary. These tensions have been fueled partly by the dispute on the Hungarian minority living in Slovakia, partly by the withdrawal of Hungary from a common project aiming at construction of a hydroelectric plant on the Danube. The third strand of the new Hungarian foreign policy was the more effective protection for Hungarian minorities. During the last 30 years, several steps were taken towards this direction. The most important ones were as follows. 1990, establishing of a new government office for policy of minority Hungarian communities. 1992, setting up a new television channel, Danube TV, in order to broadcast via satellite for the Hungarians living abroad. 1993, ratification of the Hungarian-Ukrainian Basic Treaty, in which Hungary recognized the frontiers of the new Ukrainian state, while Ukraine promised to guarantee minority rights in cultural affairs and local governments. 1995-1996, signing similar basic treaties with Slovakia and Romania. 1998, setting up of a new foundation for supporting Hungarian language education and training in the neighboring countries, including a teacher training college in Ukraine and a new private university in Romania, in Oradea, called Parcel. 2001, establishing two private universities, one in Romania, Sapientia, one in Slovakia. Both have been assured of regular budget support from Hungary. In the same year, a new law was adopted which granted financial support to the native Hungarians in all neighboring countries to promote preserving their Hungarian identity. In practice, it means supporting those who are traveling to and in Hungary and whose children attending schools where the language of instruction is Hungarian. In order to have this support, a Hungarian certificate is needed, which is issued on application by Hungarian authorities. 2010, after a long and sharp public debate, the Hungarian parliament adopted a law which grants citizenship to minority Hungarians. Most of the neighboring states accepted it, but Ukraine and Slovakia raised obstacles. According to the law, there is no difference between Hungarian citizens living in Hungary and abroad, except that the latter do not pay taxes in Hungary. Summing up the policy of Hungary towards the Hungarian minority communities in the last 3 decades, we can conclude that it developed from supporting the reproduction and development of the national identity of minority Hungarians to the idea of unifying the divided Hungarian nation, cultural nation, without changing the borders, the frontiers. After dealing with domestic and foreign political aspects of the last 30 years, I am going now to outline the process of economic transformation in the same time period. In this respect, the main goal was changing the ownership of enterprises from a predominantly statist model to one based on private ownership. All parties accepted this. The result of this restructuring, which occurred in the 1990s, has been a massive change in the pattern of ownership. Whereas in 1989, enterprises in state sector had still accounted for 95% of GDP, with privately owned firms contributing only 5%. By 1998, the state-owned sector only generated 20%, and the private sector 80%. Considering the output of the private sector, almost 50% came from domestically owned and 20-25% from foreign-owned businesses. At the top of the list of foreign investment stood again Germany. All in all, by the end of the millennium, Hungary had succeeded in evolving a market economy in which private ownership of industry and business was once again the dominant feature. The process of privatization was linked to compensation for those whose property had been expropriated by the state after 1947. After 1947 was chosen because there was no intention to compensate the big landowners expropriated within the framework of the 1945-46 land reform. Altogether, some 1.8 million claims for compensation were submitted, and the state disbursed coupons totaling 300 billion forint. Restitution was made in full for the first 200,000 forint of a claim. But for amounts above this, above 200,000 forint, payment was cut back on a steeply regressive scale with an upper limit of 5 million per item or property or per person. The compensations coupons could be used to purchase a private dwelling, establish a life annuity, obtain shares in state-owned enterprises, or in certain land purchases. Cooperative and state farms were required to designate tracts of land to be given of the claimants in return to the coupons that they held. The compensation and the privatization process in general resulted in similar sweeping changes in patterns of property ownership in agriculture to those seen in other branches of the economy. By 1996, when the compensation program had essentially been completed, the proportion of the country's farmland that was held by cooperatives was reduced from 72% to 22%. The share owned by business enterprises doubled from 13 to 28%, while the proportion which was in the hands of individual proprietors more than tripled from 15 to 50%. In 1997, 1.7 million families, or more than 40% of all families in Hungary, owned some piece of agricultural land, and these families cultivated 45% of the country's entire agricultural land. Almost 80% of these farmed areas under 1 hectare, by 17% of them farmed areas between 1 and 10 hectares. At the end of the 1990s, the average area per farm in Hungary was 17 hectares, compared with the 42 hectares in France and 32 hectares in Germany. No surprise that Hungarian agricultural output decreased by more than 30% in the 1990s, and it amounts even today to about 80% of the 1989 output. Thus, we can conclude that the Hungarian property structure in the agriculture created during the change of regime proved to be much less effective than it was expected. There exists today a consensus among experts that the concentration of landed property and the evolution of a more optimal farm structure are to be expected. The transformation to a market-driven economy based on private ownership took place against a background of extremely difficult external economic conditions, arising partly from the collapse of the established common markets, partly the European Union's protectionist policies in relation to agricultural produce, and not least from the lack of competitiveness of substantial proportion of Hungarian goods on world markets. Because of all these, the Hungarian economy at first fell into deep recession after 1990. GDP for 1993 was 18% below that for 1989. 1989 GDP levels were reached only in 1999. As mentioned, of all the main areas of the economy, it was agriculture which had been suffering the most. But the industrial output more than doubled by 2005-2006. Even more than manufacturing, the previously underdeveloped infrastructural and tertiary sectors were booming too. The huge drop in GDP at the start of the 1990s led inescapably to sharp declines in personal incomes. Between 1989 and 1997, the real value of net incomes of people fell by 26%, while old age pensions dropped by almost 1/3 in real value. Wages reached the 1989 level only in 2004. The general deterioration in living conditions and the widening of disparities in living standards disillusioned large segments of society. In the latest years, the perception of the present and the future somewhat improved, however. But the frustration in the society is still significant, which makes government's business not easier. Thank you very much for your attention.
I enjoyed Professor Ignác Romsics' presentation. Thank you so much. Next presentation will be given by Professor Iryna Zbyr. Professor Iryna Zbyr is currently professor at the Department of Ukraine Studies at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. The topic to be presented is Totalitarianism and Ukraine Literature, Traumatic Memory and Revelation of Past. Please welcome Professor Iryna Zbyr.
Hello everyone, here let me introduce my presentation, Totalitarianism and Ukrainian Literature, Traumatic Memory and Revelation of the Past. The totalitarian regime was one of the most tragic and traumatic pages in the recent history of Ukraine. Typical features of this regime include violating the human rights. In particular, we have to mention the Holodomor at its famine of 1932-1933, Proskurkulenia, the Soviet campaign of political repressions of human and their families in 1999 and 1932, and collectivization of Ukrainian peasants, cruel repression toward Ukrainian intellectuals in the 1930s and then in the 1940s and 1960s to 1970s. Numerous open and secret resolutions aimed at revelage Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism, but in reality against Ukrainian culture, language, and national self-conscience. Ukrainian literature of the 20th century endeavored to research this problem artistically on various stages of its development. Besides that, up to the late 1980s, the writers who were inside the totalitarian system had only two ways of perceiving it, either conformism or dissidence. Unfortunately, the majority of works written in 1920s, 1980s were marked by adaptiveness to the requirements of the Communist Party. As a result, there are texts that justify totalitarianism of the communism authorities instead of reflecting on its destructive impact on the person's soul. The interest in depicting totalitarian impact on the individual's life in the literature of the late 20th, early 21st century account for political and social phenomena. As a rule, in the context of literary criticism, the notion of totalitarianism is linked to a pseudo-literary movement that is social realism, a need to follow established narration, rules, and the influence of the ruling regime on all spheres of cultural life. The artists who wrote their work at the peak of totalitarian regime had to find themselves at the culmination of social realism. In their text, they are supposed to follow the established and unified canons that first of all corresponded to the party's line. Its impact on the development of literary process and its destructive consequences are analyzed by many scholars. Considering and analyzing the specificity of totalitarianism and its impact on the public consciousness as well as the identity of future generations, the text of contemporary fiction turned into a metaphorical podium between historical and present-day memory. Describing the traumatic experience of post-totalitarian society, a literary work today most fully highlights problems having a crucial impact on geocultural policy of the post-totalitarian state. Nowadays, Ukrainian literature demonstrates double remonstrance against the totalitarian past. Firstly, we can see in it a speedy protest against social realistic heritage. This process manifests itself in a long-term search for characteristic form of artistic self-expression, and secondly, contemporary Ukrainian writers resort to overall reviews of consequences of cultural stagnation provoked by the experience of years-long totalitarian terror. As we know, totalitarianism first of all interfered with freedom of individuality, thinking and speech that proved vitally important for the natural development of literature. By Orwell, the totalitarian regime prohibited not only to speak your mind but also to think. In these conditions, literature, which was supposed to reflect the author's free view on topical reality, finds itself under a total threat. Art as an effective means of propaganda and realization of the right myth and stereotypes has played a strategic role in forming and establishing totalitarian regimes. Their propaganda spread not only through their leaders' pathetic speeches and mass media, but first and foremost through culture which was totally reoriented to serve the state system. In this context, literature played the role of probably the most significant translator of ideological senses and served as an effective mechanism of transforming a class-specific public consciousness into the mass consciousness. As a consequence, the fiction work that they are artistically original and reflected the essence, contradicting the imposed ideology, they are prohibited and destroyed. By the majority of writers of these times, they are shot. The communist regime in the Soviet Union oppressed the intellectuals, confiscated literature with national and historical content, and the works reflecting fresh art tendencies. The modernist principle, art for art's sake, was totally revised and fully politicized. According to Baden, communist politicians, they are neither literary nor art critics, but they unreservedly try to create a mandatory and the only correct piece of art by this socialism. Another reason for the cultural trauma was terror against the elite and ethnic minorities, finally the whole nations. Ideological propaganda justified all their repression as the most effective way to fight with politically unreliable elements that are hostile to the state. Concentration camps serve as means of punishing the so-called enemies. They are one of the cruelest inventions of totalitarianism. As we understand, they are not only place for imprisonment, compulsory labor, or physical breakdown, but the environment for intellectual and moral devastation. The trauma turned out to be so severe that Ukrainian literature, even today, with the exception the several work, An Angel in Grey by Humenyuk, The Night of Love and Hope by Romanchuk, The Red by Kokotyuka, Memories and Individuals, researchers practically avoid the concentration camps term. The reason for this seems rather obvious. The post-Soviet memory a priori associates the communist past with the nothing but concentration camp. There a person was pushed to happiness by an iron hand. World War II still remains one of the cross-cutting themes in literature throughout decades. Todorov claims that in Europe, the memory of the war is excessively topical due to numerous commemoration events and media discourses of new local conflicts that sometimes arise in places where the communist policy used to have a crucial impact on public consciousness. World War II has become a turning point in the history of civilization in general. It activated research into the memories of human experience, first and foremost in its traumatic dimension. Rehabilitation of the post-war world has turned out to be a complicated and decades-long process. Right after Hitler's Germany officially capitulated, the Soviet Union took on a role of the single winner and proprietor on the regained lands of the Eastern and Central Europe. Recently, it has finally become apparent that Soviet Army's victory in that War II turned out to be a victory of one totalitarian ideology, another one. Paradoxically, the topic of such traumatic experience is exploited not in the society of defeated, but in the winner's culture. The Soviet ideology has practically sacralized the myth of the war. The USSR took on an uncompromising right of the victim. According to their ideology, even Holocaust victims have lost the chance to be fully acknowledged, especially on the territories of the Union's ideological influence. Taking into account that the geography, we understand that the biggest fights took place on territories between Germany and Russia. After the war, practically all these lands became part of the Soviet Union. Timothy Snyder said that all these territories is a bloody land. By saying so, he implies not the political geography of the empires, but the human geography of victims. Indeed, the bloody lands are the places where the most murderous regimes in Europe implemented their darkness acts. Post-war literary texts up to the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, they are written exclusively with the social realism. Alternative literature, that is text published in diaspora or secretly, either had no access to the Soviet reader or this access was strictly limited. Several works replace the Ukrainian dimension of this trauma. They are published in Immigration. Here we mean A Cycle on Fire and A Person Running, Other the EEBIs by Ivan Bahryany, Why Doesn't the Fire Heal by Ulla Samchuk, and Ukrainian on Fire by Alexander Dovzhenko. Another peculiarity of totalitarianism is unprecedented violation of secret culture of the defeated nation, in particular spirituality that was based in Ukraine culture on Christianity and the Church. While the totalitarian doctrine is being established, the religion is replaced by another. As we know, philosophical tendency of the Greek of century also changed so dramatically that religion was undergoing total reconsideration. God, who, according to Nietzsche, has lost his sacred meaning, no longer inspired unconditional trust and did not live up to the expectation the masses had for the future. It also promoted formation of brand new worldview paradigms. Totalitarianism introduced a different ideals and the cult of a leader. Creators of the New World Order used this chance to the full. Liquidation of the religious factor on early stages of the Soviet state later promote active development of the so-called Homo Sovieticus. As far as the masses became a fundamental element of the totalitarian system, it's understandable that the authority of so-called leader of the pack that subconsciously shouldered all the responsibility was necessary. Apart from the functions of the guide, the leader was supposed to replace God, who, according to Nietzsche, had died. In the totalitarian idea, a ruler becomes a providential figure, a duty bearer of people's safety and quiet life. The more catastrophic the social situation looked, and the faster traditional values, norms, and structures lost their topicality, the more intensive the need for the leader was. Numerous modern literary works reconsider this aspect of totalitarianism. The above-mentioned texts, The Red by Kukuchuka, The Night of Love and Hope by Rumachuk, The Split Sky by Talan are especially vivid examples. Moreover, it is these works that provide a broader interpretation of the problem. The sacralizing images of the great winner, the father of people, and effective manager embodied by Stalin, contemporary writers refer to historical reality, finding more and more common features between Hitler's and Stalin's politics, especially their attitude towards the captive people. Dispelling Soviet ideological myth about a good and bad ruler, many contemporary scholars reach a conclusion that there is no and there cannot be any positive dimension of totalitarianism. Ukrainian growth of the 1990s to 2000 in general seems to be a successful attempt to provide a fresh interpretation of the relationship between an individual and the totalitarian society. Totalitarian politics in its different version was based on discrediting the past and creating such a society that had the right to know only about the past, complying with the official ideological doctrine. The totalitarian regime manipulates historical and cultural memory, whereas fiction appeared to be an effective instrument in putting this into practice. In conditions of past totalitarian reality, it seems vitally important to dispel this vicious tradition. Contemporary Ukrainian growth, it means not only to fix the situation, but also to open these pages of the past. They are modified by propaganda and now give the chance to the societies traumatized by totalitarianism to regain their own identity. Thank you for your attention.
I enjoyed listening to Professor Iryna Zbyr's presentation. Thank you for your hard work. Next presentation will be made by Dr. Kim Shinkyu. Dr. Kim Shinkyu is a senior researcher at the East European and Balkan Institute at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. The title is Illustration as Dealing with Past Injustice in Czech Republic. Please welcome Dr. Kim Shinkyu.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shinkyu Kim. I'm a senior researcher at East European Balkan Institute, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Today, I will talk to you about restoration as dealing with past injustice in Czech Republic. I will begin with an introduction. Almost of all emerging democracies have faced with a Huntington called the torturer's problem and have accompanied various forms of transitional justice. And it is often said that how to resolve negative legacies of a previous regime would be important to consolidate still fragile democracy. So the question of how to deal with the previous undemocratic regime's functionaries and collaborators was regarded as one of the important foundations of development of democracy in post-communist Czech Republic. And at the same time, it would cause political conflicts between those who are for and against it. When violent conflict ends or undemocratic regimes collapse, perpetrators and victims of violence have no choice but to live together in one community. In this situation, it is necessary to punish or reprimand perpetrators in any way and to protect victims. These include criminal prosecution of perpetrators for violation of human rights and abuse of power, the restitution of property and declassification of sacred files, etc. But none of them fully answer the questions: who is to be blamed, what fair penalty would be, how wide the scope would be, and what is the best way to deal with the past and prepare the future democracy. The purpose of answering these questions is to heal divisions in society that arise as a result of human rights violations, to bring closure and heal the wounds of individuals and society, particularly through truth-telling, to provide justice to victims and accountability for perpetrators, to create an accurate historical record for a society, to restore the rule of law, to reform institutions to promote democratization and human rights, to ensure the human rights violations are not repeated, and last, to promote coexistence and sustainable peace. Although answering these questions would be the important things to the society and people concerned, it is not sufficient to cure the victims and to break away from the legacies of the undemocratic regime. In some cases, decisive and resolute measures are needed, such as legal punishment, public blame against the perpetrators and collaborators who broke the law and human rights in the past. Czechs experienced undemocratic regime and has been trying to deal with the past injustice and cure the negative legacies in order to construct a new democracy. For these goals, various measures have been taken to deal with the past injustice and to cure the victims and to promote democratic consolidation. These measures were concluded under the Restoration Law. However, at the same time, Restoration had a negative side of being misused for political purposes. Based on this background, I will examine whether the Czech Restoration Law adopted after the Restoration has been contributing to collecting the past injustice and building a new justice. And then I will briefly review whether the Restoration Law has been abused to weaken political rivals and being used to incite the public. And now let's talk about what made the start of the dealing with the past injustice in Czech Republic. Václav Havel, elected as the first democratic president after communist regime collapsed, several times expressed the necessity of special measures to liquidate the past communist injustice. He argued that there was a desperate need to reflect on the communist past in society, to get rid of the people who had terrorized the nation and conspicuously violated human rights, and to remove them from the high-ranking positions that they were still holding despite the regime changing. After the Bell Revolution in November 1989, there were arguments to remove the formal agents and collaborators of the security services from important public offices, together with the enactment of legal measures to prevent them from assuming such posts in the near future. Some have regarded these measures as the most important prerequisite for the development of society and the guarantee of a fragile democracy. However, some feared that it could undermine human and fundamental rights and could be misused as a method of political retaliation. Despite many concerns about the violation of human individual liberties, such as freedom of expression, right to privacy, and discrimination in development, supporters of certain legal measures argued democratic regime should not turn a blind eye to former undemocratic regimes' injustice and wrongdoings. Allowing former communist collaborators to enjoy their spoils in the new democracy might dismay citizens who have been economically or socially disadvantaged by reform processes and shatter the government credibility in the new democracy. Supporters of legal action are discontented with the former regime's collaborators who still have occupied high ranks in executive, judiciary, state enterprises, and other state organs. And they convinced that former communist elites won't accept the existence of the new order and will be the potential danger to the new democracy. It was natural that the Communist Party, whose political activities were guaranteed even after the regime change, opposed to the enacting of a Restoration Law for liquidating the past injustice and refused to verify the candidate for parliamentary elections scheduled in 1990. However, the need to redress the past injustice more systemically and to verify communist allies, namely lustration emerged after the Civic Forum and Public Against Violence won overwhelming victory in the general election in 1990. Following the success of the revolution and the collapse of the communist regime in 1989, there had been rumors that politics and economy were stuck in former secret police agents and informants, so that there would be no real revolutionary change. And democratic elites were anxious that the communists would try to overthrow the new and still vulnerable democracy. In this uncertain and unstable situation, the law forced to open all classified documents filled by secret police during the communist period and remove someone found to had collaborated with the former communist regime. It was necessary for the new government and parliament to take immediate steps not to lose public trust and to make government parliament more trustworthy and to retain the support for transition process. For this reason, already in January 1991, the federal parliament established the Committee for Verification of Senior Public Officers. The verification committee first verified whether the federal lawmakers had cooperated with the old secret police and ordered the former communist informants to disclose the fact within 15 days. This verification work was embodied as the lustration law in 1991. Due to fierce debates between pros and cons, this law enacted as a 5-year statute of limitations. And the next part is about what was the purpose and who was the target. The original title of the law, which screens or verified senior officials and candidates for the high ranks in government and state enterprises, broadcasting stations, judicial authorities, the police and the army, etc., was the law number 415-1, 1991. 4th October 1991. Generally, it was called lustration law. Lustration is originally derived from the Latin word lustratio, meaning purification by religious rites, especially spiritual or moral. But it generally implies the purification of states, organization from their wrongdoing and injustice under the communist regime, and is often used as a synonym with decommunization and screening process, and prohibiting someone from holding high-ranking positions in government, judicial, police, army, and other state organizations. Lustration is variously defined. For example, paying attention to the policy of liquidating its undemocratic heritage, as to define it as preventing certain personnel from taking high positions in the new regime. Goebbels used the concept of lustration as the judicial punishment for exclusion of certain persons from public office. Kast divided lustration into two parts and defined it as a punishment for high-ranking officers of the previous regime and a verification procedure for middle and low-ranking officers. Meanwhile, Offit divided the methods of dealing with the past into retaliation and disqualification, and understood that the disqualification was the same concept as lustration. With the concept of the backward-looking justice and forward-looking justice, he warned if someone with a problematic past take over the important political, administrative, or professional positions, a new democracy would be threatened. Therefore, in general, lustration is used as a concept that refers to official screening or verification, as well as the overall aspect of liquidating past injustice. In this respect, Sadurski distinguished between lustration and decommunization. He referred to lustration as a verification of those who hold high-ranking positions, and decommunization as a deprivation of the rights to be a candidate for a position. As similarly, Charnotta defined lustration in a broad sense encompassing vetting, accessibility to confidential documents, and decommunization. Lustration in Czech Republic means a legal process ranging from opening the classified documents and disqualifying from high officials those collaborated with a previous regime, which encompasses the proof of dealing with the past. Therefore, to lustrate means to vet or to screen certain communist elites. Thus, lustration may be used in the exclusion of individuals from politics, executive, judicial, state enterprises, and also used in judicial punishment for past wrongdoings under the communist regime. In Czech Republic, the lustration is not meant to punish all the former communist elites and to criminalize all activities that were legal under the communist regime, but to cleanse up personnel who cannot be trusted to hold high-ranking positions due to the past wrongdoing and injustice. In short, the lustration in Czech Republic is not for punishment, but for preventing a repetition of communist injustice. But they were concerned that the law might be unconstitutional, especially the communists insisted it would destroy the constitution that guaranteed the freedom to choose occupation and right to engage in work and privacy. For example, Alexander Dubček, then the chairman of Federal Assembly, instituted it was important to collect past criminals, but lustration law contained unconstitutional provisions. And also, 99 deputies of the Federal Assembly submitted to the Constitutional Court a petition seeking a decision whether the lustration law was in conformity with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Basic Freedom, with the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and with the Constitutional Act on the Czechoslovak Federation. The Constitutional Court abrogated several provisions but upheld the law constitutionality in its substance on November 1992. The lustration law prescribed prerequisites for high-ranking positions filled by election and appointment in government departments, army, security service, police, and presidential office, etc. Also, it applied to parliamentary office and office of the Constitutional Court, office of the Supreme Court, and presidium of the Academy of Science, radio television stations, and Czech press agency. This law also applied to the state enterprises, such as railways, state funds, state financial institutions, and the central bank. And after breakup of the Czechoslovakia, the lustration law was twice extended in Czech Republic on 1995 and 2000. And the law has become a permanent law since 2000. But the Slovaks had no political will to enforce the federal lustration law. Vladimir Mečiar, who won parliamentary election in 1992, promised never to introduce lustration. Lustration law still remained formally in force, but was never implemented in practice, and the law was automatically repealed in 1996 in Slovakia. The main reason why the lustration law had not been extended and abolished in Slovakia was that many political elites didn't want to lustrate past political, executive, and judicial injustice. Even many of them had been involved in their past wrongdoings. No wonder that former communist Mečiar was not interested in personal verification, which might have limited his own political influences. Though the Slovak Constitutional Court ruled that federal laws were still in effect, lustration itself had been hardly implemented in Slovakia. Even peaceful turnover of power in 1996 failed to resume the process of lustrating past injustice and wrongdoing. There were multiple reasons for this. First of all, political elites couldn't afford to lustrate or deal with the past because they were faced with a vast majority of challenges arising from transition process. At the time, new coalition government included the left parties such as SOP and SDL, and its former communists still maintained influence within the parties. Since they had negative views on liquidation as well as personal verification, the right wing within the coalition government could not pursue it independently. Thus, transitional justice was only applied a decade later in the adoption of the law on national memory in 2002. Despite the purpose of the law on national memory was to collect and publish information about collaborators with the past secret police, there were no social or criminal sanction was envisaged against them. And I will I will focus on the evaluation of the restoration in Czech Republic. From 1991 to 2014, a total of 488,012 personal screening took place, of which only 10,611 cases found out positive. The positive means that the name was in list on secret police files. Therefore, he or she was unfit to hold a position listed in the law. The overwhelming majority of applicants for screening was found not to be listed as informant or agent of secret police. As earlier defined, the illustration law in Czech Republic was a screening or verifying process for diminishing the influence of communist legacy. It was said that the law could protect young democracy from the potential threats of the old elites, dismantle the remaining communist cliques, and weaken their social, political, and economic captors by inhibiting its members from occupying high positions. And the law endowed the new organizations with legitimacy by cleansing its members and structure. Despite the above-mentioned statement, critics argued illustration law may cause such discriminatory behaviors as violation of civic liberties and privacy, and may violate fair employment laws. For these reasons, the international human rights community has spoken out against illustration law for their violation of individual liberties such as freedom of expression, privacy, and due process of law. And the International Labour Organization alleged that illustration law was discriminates on the basis of political opinion. The ILO expressed that such a violation is not permitted in a democratic society because it does not meet the individual principle. The ILO also criticized the law would discriminate a certain person based solely on holding a particular office during the last 41-year communist period, regardless of the individual person's view or behavior. Moreover, critics against the illustration law have argued that the law is subject to political manipulation by certain political parties. As the intensity of the political competition between Democratic and Communist Party increased, the ruling parties had attempted to widen the scope and applicability of the law in order to prevent or weaken the communists and to strengthen their political power. As the center-right and the center-left parties perceived the threat from the communists, they agreed to extend the law indefinitely in 2000. For this reason, illustration law was often misunderstood to be used to block certain political actors and even to eliminate them from the politics. Another problem with the illustration law is that it was based on dubious evidence. Actually, the authenticity of the secret police files, which was used as evidence to illustrate, was questioned. Given the fact that secret police usually spread lies and disinformation for controlling and oppressing the opposition, And informants and collaborators often leaked fake evidence to hide themselves, not sure if the information and documents of secret police was real and who the collaborators or informants were. In many cases, all or a part of the file had been selectively destroyed or published, so the authenticity of the file could not be verified until today. In the Czech case, prior to the paramount investigation of secret police files, almost of all the files had been destroyed, leaving only on certain files that seemed to be of little value as evidence. Not only were the files themselves suspicious and insufficient, but the handling of this information by new actors were also suspicious, because it might be manipulated by political parties vying for the vote in elections. And now I will turn into the conclusion. According to Hughes, there were three alternatives to lustration: criminal prosecution, unconditional amnesty, and truth reconciliation. Although after the French Revolution, post the First World War, France, Netherlands, Belgium chose criminal prosecutions, but the post-Civil War, America carried out an unconditional amnesty, and in South Africa had been chosen truth and reconciliation. After the collapse of the communist regime, Czech Republic chose the Restoration Law, which was not to criminalize the past, and also not to forgive the past injustice and wrongdoing. Though not intending to punish everyone who had worked for the previous regime, judging from the Czech Restoration Law, the law was aimed to screen and include former Secret Service functionaries and communist officials from certain public offices. Based on the Restoration Law, those who served as officers and agents of the Communist Security Service, while as senior party officials from district level upwards, would be excluded from high-ranking positions in government, public administration, the military, security services, state media, state enterprise, senior academic post, and judicial, etc. Actually, it did not intend to punish all the communist elites, but to uncover the truth and not to repeat the past injustice. So it can be concluded that the aim of the cleansing the past injustice, that is restoration law in Czech, is to set history right and to collect wrong history. However, doubt remains that our restoration law can be used to oust political rivals and agitate the public in a new fragile democracy. That's what I want to talk to you. Thank you for your attention.
I really enjoyed the presentation of Dr. Kim Shinkyu. Next is my presentation. I'm Dr. Tae Hyun, a senior researcher at the East European and Balkan Institute at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. My presentation topic is wooden language of Romania during the communist period and the changes after political transition. Hello everyone, I'm Tae Hyun, a senior researcher at the East European and Balkan Institute at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Today's topic is wooden language of Romania during the communist period and changes after the political transition. Introduction. Romania's communist dictatorship attempted to reduce public discontent in several ways, one of which was to manipulate public opinion. To do so, the communist regime used the language, which had been designed with special stylistics, called the wooden language. Rather than resolving complaints through communication, this language aims to hide the political reality of communist dictatorship, making it difficult to even address these complaints. Romanian linguists started studying the language of this style after the 1989 regime change, since it could not have been criticized under the communist dictatorship. They noticed that the characteristics of language were similar to the concepts of langue de bois, which was first discussed by French linguist Francois Tom. The borrowed term wooden language refers to particular style of language used during communist period. Those who thought the value of this language was meaningful only for communism believed that it would disappear along with the regime change. But this was not the case. Just as the remnants of communism lingered past this change, linguistic remnants too remained and were transformed into a unique literary style in democratic regime. Concept and stylistic characteristics of wooden language. The wooden language of communist regime has not yet been sufficiently studied. The term wooden language is not a common terminology of unified concept. Additionally, the term is not well known because there is no similar expression in English, a language used internationally and is simply an English translation of French term langue du bois. In fact, its closest English expression is newspeak, which was used in the novel 1984 by George Orwell to refer a new form of language used in the totalitarian countries. Through this term, newspeak, George Orwell tried to express the idea of controlling the diversity of thinking by reducing diversity of meanings of words in the novel 1984. The diversity of cognitive processes, that is, freedom of thinking and interpretation, can be controlled by reducing lexical polysemy, and this is the main function of wooden language. A notable part of the definition of wooden language is that it is used exclusively in totalitarian states. Many definitions have accepted it as a byproduct of communist regime. Therefore, many scholars believe that the use of this language would disappear by the end of communism. But even today, more than 30 years after the transition, its characteristics remain in Romanian society. After the transition of political system, the wooden language in Romanian society developed toward linguistic globalization centered on Eastern world, Western world, while maintaining the existing linguistic form and function. New changes influenced by the changing political, economic, and social-cultural developments, such as the development of democracy, economic prosperity, evolution of various communication technologies, and diversification of media were added to the use of sustain this existing language. The nature of wooden language is another aspect that requires discussion to define it. In this study, we understand that this language is related to the problem of stylistics. The French term langage refers to language as a set of semiotic systems, such as specific terminology and slang, metaphors, expressions, and vocabulary selection at the social level that perform certain social functions. Romanian linguist George Pruteanu also defined wooden language from a similar point of view. That is, a language manipulated to distort political discourse in the totalitarian regime with the complexity of professional vocabulary, grammar, and stylistic features. According to his definition, wooden language is defined by its stylistic aspects and can be called langage or semiotic language. The functionality of a language can be classified as the internal function for thinking and the external function for communication. The style of wooden language can be seen as having a relationship with both internal and external functions of language. The internal function of language in this article refers to the function of thinking and cognition through language. Since humans express their own thoughts and also recognize external thoughts through language, the structure of human thoughts and cognition develops by interacting with the structure of language. This means that the structure of language affects thinking and cognition and vice versa. The process of creating metaphors and expressions in the internal function of language is a crucial part of language structure and affects cognition and thinking. Regarding metaphors, this can be seen in George Lakoff's and Mark Johnson's famous book, Metaphors We Live By. The use of metaphors is not limited to literary works for artistic effects, but is also widespread in neutral everyday language. The conceptual metaphor theory proposed in this book illustrates the use of metaphors in non-literal language domains, such as the language of newspapers, broadcasting, and scientific studies. For example, you can see many abstract concepts that are explained by metaphors, such as argument is combined with military metaphor defending. That is, defending an argument, where theory is determined by metaphor for construction, building. That is, building a theory. The concepts that neither seen nor tangible are explained in connection with concrete ideas such as war and architecture. In this process, many conceptual metaphors are created through the correspondence of source domain and target domain. The source domain is an abstract concept, whereas the target domain is more concretized concept. Abstraction can be understood by mapping the abstract concepts that are invisible and intangible into the space of concrete and visible concepts. For example, in the expression, time is gold, time is the source domain and gold is the target domain. It is possible to clearly conceive its meaning by matching the non-specific but important object of time to gold, which can be easily seen as being specific and important. There is a high possibility that the words referring to source and target domains are polysemantic. In the process of selecting one meaning out of these diverse meanings, an intervention in the field of thinking and cognition appears. For example, for those who do not think of time as a concrete entity, the expression time is gold cannot be made. In this respect, it can be said that thinking involves metaphors, considering that there is a mutual influence between the structure of language and of thinking and cognition. Metaphors can also affect thinking and cognition. Therefore, a difference in the understanding of the specific metaphor corresponding to the abstract concept can lead to a different understanding. For example, in the polysemantic word gold above, it is possible to perform a semantic manipulation that connects time with negative aspect, such as mammonism rather than importance. Alternatively, by using this widely known expression, one can create an expression such as communism is gold, and imprint that communist ideology as important as entity as time. Furthermore, as George Orwell's novel 1984, it is possible to praise or undermine the meaning of the source domain more reliably and simply by denying the polysemantic feature of words and assigning only the desired meaning. Linguistic manipulation of wooden language may thus occur in this process of using metaphors corresponding to the source and target domains. Other than metaphors, general expressions can also influence human cognition. As seen in Ogden and Richard's semantic triangle, this is because the conceptual connection between the denoting object and the language sign indicating it is not directly established. In other words, a symbol cannot directly indicate an object. This point is more evident in abstract ideologies or philosophical ideas than in concrete objects. For example, in the expression, I like books, book as a symbol may be used with definite articles and indicative adjectives to indicate it as a specific object. But book, as an abstract meaning, could be delivered only by the concept of book. For example, in the sentence, reading a book increases your thinking ability, the sign book is not referring to a specific book, but the concept of a book. For a substance that is commonly present and can be touched by hand, such as a book, the object and concept are generally considered the same. It becomes clear that the referent is indirectly connected by the concept when we talk about a dragon, for example, an imaginary being that no one has directly seen. However, its existence can be imagined and expressed in language because we understand the dragon conceptually. In general, the relation between objects and signs is arbitrary, but some words contain intentionally derogatory and discriminatory meanings, and the continuous and repeated use of these non-value natural expressions can affect our thinking, as seen in words that refer to class, race, and gender. The external function of language can be defined as the function that allows the perception of one individual to interact with that of another. This is often referred to as verbal communication. Although the function of communication through language can be defined in various ways, Roman Jakobson's classical thesis, which analyzes and explains 6 functions of verbal communication, is still widely cited. According to Jakobson's theory in communication, the sender delivers a message which is coded to represent the referent to the receiver. All these processes require a channel that is physical contact. Each of the 6 elements has its own main function. In wooden language, these 6 elements are superimposed upon utterance and can conceal certain facts or distort the truth in process of combining and operating the various functions. At the time of utterance, specific symbols, qualitative comparison, physical repetition, and semantic reinforcement appear through manipulation of speaker's will, special coding, message composition, and channel of delivery. The characteristics of wooden language, such as avoidance of concrete expressions, repetition of synonyms, bad metaphors, and dichotomous classification of good and bad, are considered to be related to the manipulation of linguistic functions. Linguistic manipulation of the internal and external functions of language in wooden language can be seen as clearly connected to the problem of stylistics. From this point of view, we will look at how the stylistic feature of wooden language affect thinking and communication in the next chapter. The wooden language of communist period. The wooden language widely used during the communist period seems to be quite a different language today, 30 years after the transition of the political systems. The element that conveys this is the vocabulary that constitutes the language and its stylistic characteristics. To find examples of wooden language during the communist period, we refer to the Wooden Language Dictionary and Tatiana Slama-Kazaku's work. Meaningless rhetoric expressions. The most common lexical feature of the communist period is the creation of a relationship between modificants and modifiers with peculiar meanings by using uncommon words. These forms of expression are typical rhetoric to represent communist ideology that are not found in Romanian today. We have already established that language structure and the function of thinking and cognition mutually influence each other. In the political rhetoric of wooden language that emerged during the communist period, the influence of this peculiar language structure on thinking and cognition functions can be noted. For example, aprobare adâncă, which means deep approval, and aprobare din adâncul inimii, which means deep approval from the heart, are expressions that are not commonly used in present Romanian. But in the communist period, these expressions mainly meant strong agreement on certain events and opinions. For example, it was used to mean was held in great success or was warmly welcomed. Pleonastic expressions. Another important characteristic often used in the wooden language of the communist period, but rarely accepted within the norm of Romanian language today, is pleonastic expressions. In certain cases, pleonasms are accepted as normative expressions even though they are redundant. For example, when pleonasms are frequently used, the redundant expression achieved a new meaning and it became the norm and was no longer redundant. The use of redundant expressions in communist wooden language can be traced to the excessive use of modifiers to exaggerate the meanings of some expressions. For example, attachament ferviente, which means hot passion, usually refers to passion for the motherland and Communist Party, but the word attachment itself already includes the meaning of ferviente, which according to the Romanian dictionary Dex means strong and lasting feelings toward someone or something. Here is another example. Înaltă bunăstare, which means high prosperity. The modifier înaltă is pleonastic because the word bunăstare already means the state of high development. Excessive use of abbreviations. Abbreviations are kind of compound words that can be seen commonly in current Romanian language. However, the semantic opacity of abbreviation was higher at the time of communism because it was difficult to know the original form of acronyms, which carried their own semantic opacity, making it difficult to grasp the meaning of these abbreviations. Of course, some well-known abbreviations, such as CC, could be easily understood. Everyone knew that it refers to the Communist Party's Central Committee without any further explanation. However, some of them were hardly known. For example, the names of organizations primarily intended to control tourists from outside of Romania, ONT, which means National Travel Management Office, and OJT, which means State Travel Management Office, were not known to ordinary farmers who lived a life far from travel. This led to the loss of interest in vocabulary and further the interest of related marriage itself, which is in line with the purpose of sustaining dictatorship through the use of wooden language. Omission of subject. Omitting the subject is a common occurrence in current Korean political and broadcasting languages. For example, according to a foreign press and according to an internet article, alternatively in a more severe way of providing no source at all, it is common to come across a broadcasting language such as "there is an opinion" in the news. The purpose of is to disguise the statement in ambiguity. It is not known whether the opinion is of the majority, the relevant parties, the media, or the reporter. The expression of subject omission in the Romanian Communist wooden language is also very similar to this purpose. Representatively, expressions such as "s-a înțeles," which means to be understood, "s-a făcut," to be done, and "s-a anunțat," which means to be known, can be cited. It can be seen that these expressions where it is not known who understood, by whom, or who informed them are typically used for the purpose of avoiding responsibility and extending ambiguity. Cliché for communist regime. The use of cliché as a typical banal expression appears in the communist wooden language, mainly in the situations that require the use of a specific vocabulary with a specific meaning to express praise to the dictator or to the communist ideology. For example, arhitect al păcii, which means architect of peace, and arhitect de istorie contemporană, which means architect of modern history, in a reference to the dictator Ceausescu. In 1968, during the Prague Spring democratization protest, Romania did not send troops to Prague. for which it received great attention from the Western world. Ceausescu was also active as a mediator during the Middle East War, when a delusion of grandeur began to rise. Additionally, instrument de massa is interpreted as the tool of the masses, but also means television. Classe muncitoare, which means working class, is actually interpreted as a citizen with duty. Dușmanul de clasă, which means enemy of the class, also means the owner of the land and bourgeois class. And loc de muncă, meaning job, was in fact a cliché meaning unemployment. Most of these peculiar communist-style clichés were forcibly learned, and the fear created by the dictatorship caused these expressions to be spread rapidly amidst the public. Metaphor. In general, metaphors associated socialist and communist ideologies with the good, whereas capitalism, bourgeois, proprietary class, and imperialism were associated with the bad. For example, bestia imperialiste, imperialist beast, and urânduirea burghezo-muserească, which means bourgeois proprietary class order, where imperialism and bourgeois proprietary classes were used in the sense of as beasts, bureaucrats, anti-nationalists, and blood-sucking vampires. On the other hand, Gândire Marxist-Leninist, which means Marxist-Leninist thinking, had the meaning of equal and fair thinking. Improvement of names such as occupation, race, and others. Lexical changes appeared during the communist period for words referring to jobs and positions of the working class. Words with derogatory meanings were replaced by those with improved meaning, which seems to be natural change in a society that ideologically emphasizes the equality for the working class. For example, servituare with the nuance of maid was changed to femeie de serviciu, meaning servicewoman. It seems obvious that the nuance of this word has comparatively improved, but this short translation caused controversy with the gender struggle. Moreover, the word țigan, meaning gypsy, was replaced with the word rom, meaning man in gypsy language. However, as can be seen from the fact that the residences of gypsies at the time of communism were implicitly limited to the outskirts of the city and separated from the rest of the Romanians. There was a lack of protection of their human rights during this period. Wooden language after regime change. Romania's wooden language after the regime transition appears in slightly different patterns. There had been an effort to manipulate various concepts representing the communist ideology using the stylistic characteristics of the wooden language during the communist period to make the language difficult to understand by creating an overall opaque semantic structure. After the transition, it can be seen that a similar type of rhetoric is used, despite the parts related to communist ideology being omitted. This exclusion of communist ideology forms the first characteristic of wooden language after the transition. The second characteristic is the influence of English. About 30 years after the transition, the France-oriented Romanian culture of the past has changed to American-oriented culture and is exposed to the influence of English language as well. However, the influence of English does not appear only in Romanian, but is a global phenomenon. This is evidenced by the spread of loan translation from English. The borrowed words in the form of translating the semantic structures of English into Romanian requires special study if you do not know English. In other words, if you are not familiar with English, it becomes difficult to understand, which produces an effect similar to that brought about by Urdu language of the communist period. For example, a jargon such as quantitative easing can be translated as relaxare quantitativo, which is difficult to understand simply by understanding the Romanian language. The third characteristic of Urdu language after the transition is the tendency to use vocabulary with abstract meanings. This type of vocabulary has been widespread in capitalist societies and has been described by Uwe Borksen as a plastic world. This vocabulary is also imported from English and used in Romania. For example, words such as platformă, which means platform, structură, which means structure, strategie, which means strategy, and valoare, which means value, appear to be somewhat specialized terms, but are widely used. These vocabularies, like plastic Lego blocks, can be combined and exchanged everywhere and have become a widespread language among the general public as they are repeatedly used by politicians, professors, CEOs, and journalists. Expert groups always use these terms repeatedly to design, explain, and obtain consent for plans and projects. Such terms are spread worldwide with the waves of globalization providing a universal vocabulary. Plastic words such as strategie and structura seem logical and scientific in their nuances, but are actually so abstract and broad in their meanings that they are not easy to be used as scientific terms pursuing conceptual precision. Thus, plastic language, not a dead language, but one for every situation, appeared after the transition in Romania and has an effect similar to that of the Urdu language of the communist period. Conclusions. The phenomena of Urdu language, which means a language that manipulates thoughts and distorts communications, began to be studied in Romanian linguistic community after the regime change in 1989. In general, this language was recognized as a tool for propaganda of the communist and socialist ideologies in various fields such as politics, economy, and culture, and was used as a language of repressive function to reduce social discontent. In this study, these points were theoretically examined in terms of the stylistic aspects of language, and examples that appear in the Romanian language were analyzed and presented under various categories. It was expected that this style of language would disappear after the regime change in 1989, but the prediction was partially incorrect. It was correct in that most of the special rhetoric and cliché in the ideological function that represented the communist dictatorship disappeared. However, Urdu language, excluding expressions referring to communism and socialism, continued to be used by some, especially the elder people, even after political liberalization. Urdu language, which continues in line with the past, shows a tendency to evolve according to the trend of globalization as well. While it is different from the Urdu language of the communist period of the past, it shows a functionally similar aspect in that it can lead to a paucity of communication and consequently a semantic distortion. In this regard, some changing aspects in Urdu language after the political transition are that which have already been criticized by Western society as plastic language. Thank you for your listening. Thank you very much.